Whew. All right, we are through the big two: gas supply and decompression. Those are the two most complicated things to determine in setting your time constraint on your dive. So these last two are typically much more straightforward. So first of these is cold tolerance, right? Being cold is no fun. Um, and so you may need to call your dive short because you are cold. Um, Excessive cold can increase your risk of injury in a number of ways. So, quite practically, um, typically for most people, the first thing that gets cold is your hands. So, if your hands are freezing and you are not able to use them and manipulate them, then you may not be able to press a button to dump gas or pull a cord to dump gas from your valves. You may not be able to unsnap a bolt snap. Those are things you want to be able to do on a dive. And the other way that cold can increase your risk is ties back to decompression risk. And really, the worst thing you can do as far as decompression risk goes is to be nice and warm and toasty at the start of your dive. And then by the end of your dive, you are freezing cold during that ascent. That is actually the worst thing you could do as far as decompression sickness risk goes. And so, if you are starting off nice and warm and you're getting cold, it is prudent to end that dive before you're absolutely frigid. So, if the water is cold and shallow, you may need to limit your dive to the point where you're too cold to safely finish the dive. So, cold can be a constraint, and it is an important thing to think about and plan on if you're diving in cold water. And the other thing is time of day. So, some coastal shore diving sites um, need to be done during slack tide. So if there's high and low tide, you often need to plan around that. And so this figure shows. So in blue here is water level. So you've got high tide here, and then low tide, and high tide again, and low tide. This is over time, and the current or the current that flows through there is actually offset a bit from this. So the strongest current you'll experience at that site is actually during falling tide, or during rising tide, you will have the strongest currents. And so often the best time to dive one of these sites is during what we call slack tide. And that is when the water level has peaked and we're right at high tide, or when it's troughed out and we're right at low tide. That's when the currents are least and you're least likely to get swept away from your car that you parked at, or wherever you're trying to be. And so that can also be a constraint on your time of day, right? I need to be out of the water by 4:05 because that's when tide's going to really be falling, and we need to be out of the water by then. And then lastly, sometimes you just got places to go and people to see after the dive. And so it's literally, I got to be home by this time, so I got to get out of the water by that time. So your time constraints in a dive are going to be, you're going to be limited by whichever is the most limiting of your gas supply, of your decompression status, of your cold tolerance, and the time of day. And so if you multiple of these are close, then, like, let's say for example, all right, I've got 50 minutes I can do with my gas supply, but only a 45-minute no decompression limit. Don't just ignore that gas supply. If you're close, maybe you're going to go through gas a little bit higher than you expected, and that is actually going to be shorter. So keep each of these in mind, both planning the dive and while you're on that dive. So that, in summary, my bare minimum requirements for a recreational dive plan. Where are you going to go? What are you going to see? And how long are you going to be down there before it's time to head up? Again, the most constraining of all those factors. And then number 3 is plan your dive and then dive your plan. Don't spend all this time making a dive plan and then blow it off.